I suppose we can go ahead and get started. Um, I will, so the format of this meeting is essentially, I'll kind of introduce myself and the PanPals project. Dr. Kutac, shall I let you introduce yourself?
Sure.
And then we will get a sort of overview of the Mysterium Tremendum as a concept from Dr. Kutac. We'll talk a little bit about our own experiences from her as a medical humanist and most recently a chaplain, and myself as a pediatrician in encountering awe, wonder, and awesome terror in our practices. And then we'd like to open the conversation up to the group and invite folks to share their own experiences of these concepts. So while for the first part, I'll ask that folks keep their microphones on mute just to minimize interference. And then when we open it up, I'll invite you guys to all join in the conversation. Okay. So I'm Rachel Pearson. I am a hospital pediatrician and an assistant professor of medical humanities here at the Center for Medical Humanities and Ethics at UT Health San Antonio. And this get together today is part of our initiative PanPals, which is a humanities-based initiative in which we're trying to respond to some of the moral and existential needs of our Central Texas community during the pandemic. We especially want to address the needs of healthcare providers, but also community members. And we feel optimistic that we can do some of this work because the humanities as disciplines of thought have been developed over thousands of years specifically to address questions of meaning. So philosophy, art, rhetoric, language, literature, these are the ways of thinking that we turn to when we're getting into these really naughty questions. That's naughty with a K-N, y'all. And I'm very excited that we have Dr. Kutac here with us today to help us think through some of this.
Yeah, it's quite an honor to be here and to be seeing your faces and knowing that each of you has an incredible story to tell, and that whether you are a healthcare provider or someone who interfaces with healthcare, which I think includes everyone, you are doing moral work in the world, and I want to recognize and honor that work that y'all do. So I am an assistant professor in the Physician Assistant Studies Department at UTMB, University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston. My background is really working at the intersection of religion, medicine, culture at the Institute for Medical Humanities, where I got my PhD with Rachel. I studied healthcare ethics and literature and narrative studies. And prior to that, I did my master's work at Rice University studying philosophy of religion. And that's really where I was first exposed to the idea of the Mysterium Tremendum. And I've been thinking with that idea for quite a long time. It's been so, interesting to think about it in a theoretical way. And then at times in my life, it erupts. These experiences erupt. And particularly since the pandemic has started, I have found these questions coming more and more to the fore. So at UTMB, there has been an all hands on deck approach to providing care. Most people are working from home, but every department volunteered or had people volunteer to enter into a labor pool to help meet the critical needs of patient care. And I have been reassigned from my work as a professor in the PA department to helping support pastoral care, because there's a limited deck of chaplains for the 5 UTMB health campuses. So they really need folks to go in and let patients know what chaplaincy could provide for them, and also to help support them on the back end so that the chaplains can go out and do that work. So the original idea, and I promise I'm going to get to the Mysterium Tremendum, but I feel like telling the story is important for framing that idea. The idea was that I would go into rooms, I would spend about 2 minutes, I would say, is there anything we can do for you? The chaplains are here if you need to talk to a chaplain. But patients aren't allowed to have loved ones in their rooms right now because of the risk for infection. And so I would go into rooms and stories were ready to pour out of patients. Not all patients. Some are in and out visits, but I found myself doing the kind of chaplaincy work that really operationalized the theories that I had had the great fortune and really luxuriousness of being able to think about, but not have to be faced with in practice. And so I've been returning to those texts that have been my faithful friends along the way. And in particular, I've been thinking with Rudolph Otto, Mircea Eliade, Erwin Goodenough, Daniel Sulmacy, and Harold Vanderpool. And it was Rudolph Otto who brought the vocabulary to us of the Mysterium Tremendum. And he was a religious scholar who had been all over the world at the turn of the 20th century, at a time when comparative religion was really taking off. And he was looking at the emotive qualities that bound religious experience together, whether or not you were a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Jain or a Jew or a Muslim or a Christian. Is there an essence of religion? And he wanted to place that in the affective realm. And so he talks about this interaction with the numinous and the horizon of that, which is the Mysterium Tremendum. And what is that? It's this phenomenon that we occasionally come in terms with that is infinite, transcendent, wholly other, and is impregnated with meaning. And he says that we live our lives in relationship with that, with what is on the other side. What is on the other side that gives rise to our experiences of feeling so fundamentally human. And apprehending, because we don't know what the Mysterium Tremendum is because it's so wholly other. We only can feel it and apprehend it, and language kind of fails us. But it's an experience that's so huge that it forces us to recognize our own smallness, our infinitesimal taking up of space within the universe. And we turn away from it. We turn away from it a lot. We have to turn away from it because it's too awful, like full of awe, it's too terrifying that we can't think about it all the time. So we turn and we fill our time with other kind of idle things, profane things that keep us going. But every so often we are attracted to it, where we want to look at it, we want to stare at it, and just have an experience that reminds us that there is something more. So I think that there are environmental spaces that cause that. Being on a mountaintop, watching a sunset, walking in the woods. There are life experiences like birth, and there are moments of ritual like graduations, you know, that are infused with meaning and become these kind of holy spaces. And I would argue that medicine works at that thin space, that space that's infused with meaning. By virtue of working with patients who are vulnerable, frail, who are dealing with their own experiences of mortality. You know, what is death but not the most mysterious thing, the thing, that space that is in between here and there, with the there being the Mysterium Tremendum. So in my work, going in and out of rooms, with a lot of conceptual training, but not so much training of, you know, the practical nuts and bolts of doing that work, it has been really powerful and profound. I get the name, the age, the sex, and one medical fact about the person that comes from Epic, and it's a bit random, and it doesn't really tell me anything really about what is bringing them into the hospital. And frankly, what's bringing them into the hospital is, it's very important medically. For my work, just appreciating them and where they are in the experience of their illness, it's less important. The what is not as important as the why and how the person is making sense of that experience. So I never really know what is behind each door. And some of those experiences are not infused with meaning. They are transactional, and that's okay. But there's one experience in particular that's, well, there are several, but there's one that, a room that I went into with a gentleman. I don't know his backstory. I only know that he had a trach, he had a tube in his nose, and so he wasn't able to speak. He could only write, and he was writing on dirty sheets of paper that somehow he had, you know, acquired in the hospital. The room smelled terrible, and he was very sick. The machines in the room were beeping, and it was loud. There was some TV show was playing, and it was filling the room with this kind of like sensory cacophony. And when I walked into the room, he wrote on the sheet of paper, "I'm so glad you're here." After I introduced myself to him, "I want to turn my life around." I don't know why, I don't know what that looks like for him, but he needed to tell someone, and there I was, an intimate stranger. Someone who had access to such a private part of his heart, yet I had only met him 5 minutes ago. And he started writing, and he said, "We are but 2 grains of sand, but God knows every grain of sand in the entire world." And in that moment, it was, the space was so full. It was so full of meaning. So I prayed with him. He thanked me. We talked a little bit more, and I left. And it was such a small moment, but in that thin space, I was able to stand in the gap with him and help him look at that great unknown. And he has stayed with me. And I imagine that, you know, this is one story for me, but every healthcare provider has stories like this. I would argue that not every provider has a vocabulary for talking about the Mysterium Tremendum, because as much as I would like Rudolph Otto to be a required reading for everyone, he's not really, you know, hitting the Amazon top 10 list anymore. But I think it's, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I love how you describe this work as trying to stand in that space with the patient. And I also love that the idea of the Mysterium Tremendum gives respect to how difficult it is to stand in that space. I was recently caring for a child who has, you know, severe burns and is facing the prospect of, you know, going into his teenage years with significant disfigurement, but is also experiencing a long hospitalization, has severe pain, and is experiencing what I think Cecily Saunders, the founder of the hospice movement, called total pain. So spiritual, existential, and physical suffering, which is not something that predominates in pediatrics, because in general my patients are so involved in the immediate world. But this kid, you know, he was old enough and had been through enough that he was feeling the despair of change that feels permanent to him. And being in the room with him, you know, was so hard for me. I was there with my residents, and I wanted to be a good example of how a doctor responds to suffering. I tried to kind of breathe in suffering, breathe out compassion. I tried to, you know, just sit with him, acknowledge that, you know, his concerns were really real. But I found myself before too long out in the hallway, like desperately calculating how to convert one opiate to another so that I could get his physical pain under control. And I know that controlling physical pain is really, really important. But I was also left wondering, you know, did I step away too quickly from that difficult space? Was I able to show my residents how to stand in front of the mystery with your patient? And so the fact that you, through this concept, the fact that you give it its due, the fact that you give it, it shows how effortful and how difficult it is to be in that place. I really appreciate.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's full of awe and it's awful. I mean, it is full of terror and wonder. So it attracts and it repels. And I think that it is unfair to say that our providers have to do that work all the time, that you have to do that for every patient. I think in meeting his physical needs, you addressed him where he was in that moment. Because I think pain has a really particular way of destroying a person's world. And for those of y'all who have read the philosopher Elaine Scarry, she writes about this in The Body and Pain, that the pain diminishes the world to nothingness. Pain, it fills and diminishes the world. All that the world is pain in that moment. It destroys language. You can't say, I hurt. You can only scream. And so I think that this is a space for compassion for the provider for the work that you did. And once you get his pain under control, you can return to him and look and maybe turn towards the tremendum again.
And is that,
So
oh, sorry
no,
to,
go.
I was just going to say, is that act of returning what you're talking about when you talk about confronting the mysterium as a way of giving us courage? Um, is it through
Yeah.
returning that we become courageous? Or can you talk a little bit more about how this mystery um, and confronting it gives us courage in facing the unknown?
Yeah, I think returning to it is absolutely a courageous act. And I think that here's where the space for understanding symbols comes in. Because the tremendum is so terrifying, because it's so full and pregnant, we think about it, or we utilize symbols to help us kind of gain access to the transcendent. And one thing that I think can help build courage is understanding that the tools that a provider uses are also symbols within medicine, that the coat, the stethoscope, the opiate it's pregnant with meaning. And you can use those in holier and less holier ways, in more sacred and less sacred ways. I would argue that, you know, managing that child's pain, working to manage that child's pain was pregnant with meaning for you, even if you were turning away from the tremendum in that moment, or you thought you were. That act of doing that was still infused with meaning. And so I think what I'm talking about when I talk about courage is not just a courageous act that you do. I think it's the rising to the day, continuing to put your feet in front of each other and provide care, recognizing that it is very hard, both emotionally, spiritually, existentially, physically. It is hard work to care for others day after day, and to act in a way of being that orients you to that knowledge. So just knowing that it's there, being attentive to it and not repressing it, I think that that's an act of courage. So just bringing it out of the shadows and naming it, I think can make it more manageable.
Yeah, that's helpful. I'm reminded to, and after this, I'm going to open it up. And Dr. Jason Glenn is here, and he has this questioning face on. So I'm gonna ask for a question from him, and then open this up to the audience. Um, but you know, that naming of it. I'm reminded of caring for a kid, like a small kid who was dying in the ICU when she had of her cancer. She was, in the final kind of days of her life, and in the final stages of life, we measure life expectancy in like minutes to hours, hours to days, days to weeks, and we were talking for her about hours to days. And she had on a mask to help her breathe and this and that. And at a certain point, I went in to check on her, and I was checking on her in part because her labs had come back and they looked pretty bad. When I walked into the room was full of this sense of quietness. And this child who I had seen in previous days working in a really subtle way to comfort her parents, she had turned inward. So her spirit, or her kind of ness, had quieted and it seemed more interior. And I remember talking to my attending about her and saying, I think she's really actively dying now. And my attending asked me, you know, why I thought that. And I could say that it was her labs, but I didn't at that time have a language to say that just the mysterium was present in the room. I wonder if I could ask Dr. Glenn to join the conversation.
Hello, everybody. You pointed out my questioning face, and what I was thinking when you all were talking about pain and how to address it, from a medical anthropology standpoint, Arthur Kleinman has made the argument that in terms of how to differentiate pain from suffering, and that suffering, or people encounter suffering when their pain is actually unacknowledged, and just trying to mesh that together, and you know, sort of put all of the experiences that you all were talking about in terms of, you know, when you stand there for someone and you be with them in these moments of incredible, transcendent uncertainty, you know, that there's an acknowledgement of their pain and their anxiety, and their fear, which I think goes toward alleviating suffering. And I think that's a very good thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I had another experience with a lady who was going home on hospice, and I held her hand and listened to her and lamented with her. We just, you know, just let her experience that. And then when I came back, a few days later, I geared myself up to, you know, stand in that space again. And she was laughing and talking to someone on the phone, and she was not in that space anymore. But standing in it and acknowledging it, that can turn the helplessness and the meaninglessness into strength. I agree with that. Thank you.
May I say something? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right? Okay. Courage to me is the backbone that you acknowledge that you're going to have to keep strong and straight into the future when you decide to take on the woes of others as a minister or a doctor or a psychologist, and know that you'll never be free of it, that you can never put your courage down somewhere and come back and pick it up later. It's always got to be with you.
Thank you, Taddy. That feels so true, and I think it feels even more true these days for so many of our colleagues. Dr. Berggren, were you going to add something?
Yes. So, you know, you mentioned touch several times, and Julie, you mentioned gearing up to go see a patient. I think you meant that in an emotional and spiritual sense. I'm an infectious disease doctor. I'll be carrying the COVID beeper this weekend. When I say gearing up, that means PPE. So in the context of COVID and bearing witness to suffering, acknowledging the pain of those whom we serve, we have some limitations because we have a mask over our face. I've already experienced how challenging it was just to go into nursing homes and try to have decent, human, compassionate conversation with nursing directors and nursing home administrators about what they're doing and how they're doing it, and trying to communicate without making them feel criticized or judged. And it's really hard to communicate all of your self and your wholeness through a mask. And then we can touch, but we're touching through a glove, right? And we're touching with some caution because we don't want to be down close. And in my own practice, if I'm comforting someone who's in great pain and it's a patient with whom I've developed a relationship, I would typically get down real close to that person's face and be very near to them. I can't do that. So having a vocabulary, which is another theme we've been talking about here, seems so much more important in this context. And so, Julie, how have you addressed some of these challenges, and what are some of the words, and how have you used them to overcome this problem?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you for sharing that. I would say I've probably done it quite badly because even though I've been wearing a mask, I've been getting probably too close and have recognized that that's a risk that I'm taking. But when I walk into the room, I usually tell them that I'm smiling. I wish they could see that I'm smiling. So I will just kind of verbalize each emotion that I'm feeling. I feel so sad with you, or that feels scary. So it's kind of a running commentary that a running emotional commentary that I'm giving. And the patients that I'm talking to have been able to talk back. And I know that for patients who are dealing with COVID, that may not be an option if they're intubated. But I think pulling those words out, saying this is scary, or this is an important space that we're in, and helping them articulate it by giving them some of the words can hopefully help mitigate it. I don't know. It's a very hard question.
Yeah, one thing I would add to that is, in pediatrics, respiratory infections are one of the most common causes for hospital admission. So frequently about half the kids on my service, I'm gowned and gloved and masked, and they're all terrified of me. And they're terrified not only because I look strange, but because people looking just like me have been in their room, putting things in their noses, doing things to them that hurt. And so they see me in that costume and they see a symbol of pain. And so the thing that I found to be most helpful for overcoming that is actually just sitting quietly for as long as I can, often on a kid's level. I'll sit in their bed. I'll try to get the kid into their parents' arms. If there's a parent there, I'll just be quietly present. And after a while, the kid will start to interact, will start to play with me a little bit. And even though that may sound particular to kids, I think it's also true for adults that after a little while, the fear and alienation that comes with the way we look can get a little better if we allow ourselves to sit, if we have time, right, to sit quietly.
Rima?
Hi, everybody. I want to echo what, is it Dr. Bergen? What Dr. Bergen kind of shared about her experience. I'm a hospitalist who works with these patients and people who are persons under investigation for COVID. So that's a huge aspect of what we deal with. I've noticed that every conversation is 10 times harder, and dealing with existential issues with patients is not easy under perfect circumstances, but when you look like a bubble-eyed alien, it's incredibly difficult. The PPE, there are times where I've seen colleagues that I know well in the PPE and not recognize them. And so one of the challenges is that longitudinal. So you're kind of not supposed to spend, you're supposed to minimize the amount of time you spend face to face with these patients, which is incredibly difficult. And so you have a very short amount of time to be reassuring, where all of your body language is sort of taken from you in a way. So, you know, and the other challenge is involving families who are, you know, obviously in a lot of our hospitals, we can't have family physically present. And so to them, you know, you're just a voice on a phone. You don't have a face to them either. So, you know, the challenge, I think the one thing I found that can be helpful is to just acknowledge that up front and say, I know I look like a bubble-eyed alien. I know I look like everyone who's walked into the room. I promise that, you know, I wish that it was different. And, you know, I hope that we can get to a point where we can have, you know, more of a personal connection and see each other, but right now we can't. And what can I, you know, what can I tell you? What can I do to make it better? And some patients, you know, some patients can respond, some patients can't, but I have had some people sort of respond very positively to that, and just acknowledging the barriers has gone a long way.
Stevie?
Hey there. Thank you, by the way, for putting this on, y'all. I wanted to ask, I thought you made some really good points about the difference, especially Dr. Glenn, the difference between pain and suffering, and how acknowledgement has such an important role to play in that. And my personal concern in all of this, in addition to the ones you've already raised, is the well-being of these healthcare providers. As you pointed out, so many of you are standing in these liminal spaces. You're standing in these thin spaces over and over and over again, and you're witnessing and you're being present during these tremendously difficult times. And that is something that I worry about my friends who are physicians already. And then in the midst of a pandemic like this, the things that you are witnessing are all the more horrific. I was hoping you might be able to say something about the psychological and emotional damage that might be having, because this is traumatic. The Mysterium is traumatic as well, because of the terror that is innately part of it. And I have noticed that a number of the physicians that I've tried to talk to and I've tried to communicate with are very concerned about speaking out about some of the things that they're experiencing, and speaking out about some of the lack of preparedness that they are encountering, and the effects that that may be having for fear of retaliation. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how all of this kind of comes together in terms of the effect on the providers.
Are there any providers who would like to respond, who have that, who may have had that experience? I would say that structural problems, structural issues that can certainly contribute and exacerbate moral distress that providers are experiencing. And there is very little, I think, relationally that addresses those structural barriers. We have to take a top-down or bottom-up approach, but it takes multiple people. On a one-to-one relational level, I think providers having a space to decompress, to talk and work through the experiences that they're having is critically important. The pastoral care here has started a couple of small interventions to try and help, because we know we can't, there are 4 of us on campus, and there are hundreds of providers, so we can only be in 4 places at once. But we have started a thing called the Daily Anchor, that's a short recording of a prayer or poem that providers can use to help anchor themselves each morning. And we've gotten a lot of positive feedback. We are creating bags that are full of symbols that we're calling spirit kits that have like a cotton ball to remind you of the softness of a soul, and a rubber band to remind you that you're flexible and can expand to fit situations, a Band-Aid to remind you that you will heal. What we're trying to do is create small cultural changes where we can witness to one another so that we can then be healers towards each other, and be recipients of that healing too. So these are only small, very small things, but hopefully these, like water over a stone, it'll help to fill in some spaces while we all work towards a more just world through institutional changes.
I would also add that I kind of share, and at different points in my training and in my career, I've been more or less afraid of being harmed by deep engagement with people who are suffering, and by engagement with people who are suffering, over and over and over and over again. I have found that that is fundamentally what medicine requires. And it's like what Taddy was saying about courage. To continue to engage and to continue to return is the essence of our job. And sometimes we are harmed by it. But we also have potential to grow in this engagement. And for me, I think a lot about John Donne, the humanist poet, who, in his meditations, devotions upon emergent occasions, he wrote, "Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind." To stand in the space of liminality, to confront the Mysterium, to encounter suffering and not walk away, is a way of being involved in mankind that can make your life extremely rich. It can harm you, but with adequate support, with community, with self-compassion, it can also deeply enrich your life. And, my mom's listening today, and hi, Mom. She's not delighted that her pregnant daughter is continuing to see patients during a COVID pandemic. But she also understands that continuing to engage is so fundamental to my identity, not only as a physician, but as a human being, that she, as a person who loves me, is making the sacrifice of being supportive of this work.
And I would like to agree with all of that, and to especially highlight the importance of self-compassion as a tool for building resilience. As providers, we all offer it to others so much. That is your duty. That courageous offering, pouring out is, like you said, the essence of being a healer. And I am firmly convinced that offering that same grace towards yourself is it's the seed for being able to build up that courage, and to be wear it like a cloak, or like a superhero's cape, to be able to move through the day.
And I do believe that sharing that compassion with each other is incredibly important as well, being a community. And I wanted to say both you, Julie, and you, Rachel, have done a beautiful job of sharing your experiences with others as well. And Julie, your letters that you've been posting to your students, I think make a big difference. I read them on Facebook, and even though I'm not one of your students, I share them with a number of people. And Rachel, similarly, your articles I've shared with a number of people. And so I think being able to provide that sense of community is a big part. Part of healing from trauma is, for many people, being able to share those stories and also being able to know you're not alone. So being able to reach out that way can be vital. So thank you.
I'd like to ask a question myself.
Sure.
This is Bill Nichols. I have my PhD also in philosophy of religion and in psychology, and was a chaplain for a while. But I'm going to speak for a minute of Dr. Bergman knows well that less than 2 years ago, I had a very serious kind of cancer and spent some good time in the hospital. And at certain times was at the point where I wondered whether I was going to live or not. And I remember, especially in ICU, I remember it came back to me that it's a very lonely place, even though people are darting in and out with their masks on. But there's a real sense of the impersonal. And I think one of the challenges of the Mysterium has always been that if we carry the idea of the Mysterium up front or to a maximum, it pushes the personal far away, so that there's somehow in the holy that it needs to be personal. And I found that one of the most healing parts when I was in and out was the nurse, oftentimes, who had this compassion and who somehow expressed the compassion in just the tone of voice. And I found sometimes that the doctors helping each other, that tone of voice, that compassion, express the personal. And of course, coming from a Hebrew Christian background, what I found also helpful was that some, when they caught on to the fact that I was a Christian, some of the nurses would then jump on that and say, well, we know that God is with you, and so forth. Which, that sense of the immanence as well as the mysterium, that you don't understand what's going on, but you when they leave the room, you're not alone. Mm-hmm. So my question was, how do you try and balance the holiness, the mystery, the awe, the unexplainable, when people have such a variety of religious experience, and yet so that they don't feel like there's just there's just machines, there's just feelings, that there's more, there's something personal about all this that can be helpful. I wonder what other people are thinking too.
Could I just speak as one of the extremely elderly care providers? I've been practicing medicine for 41 years. And to say the least, I'm in awe of this group of people, many of whom I know here today, and y'all have helped me a great deal. But first off, you talk about courage, and we tend to think of courage as a one-time event, and I would like to think of it more as steadfastness. My wife would call it stubbornness, but I would call it steadfastness. The second is that, we all get support from different areas. I actually have learned a lot from my son. One of he's in his third year of his PhD training in theology at the present time in Berkeley, California. But when he did his pastoral training, what he developed as his opening statement when he went in the room was not to ask the patient how they were, but his opening statement was always, how is your spirit today? And I kind of use that myself to reflect on myself and how is my spirit today to help me get through each of these days. So thank you.
Thank you.
That's really beautiful, Dr. Beach. I'm going to start asking myself that question. I really appreciate that. Other thoughts from the audience? And I particularly want to take up this question of the personal and the mysterium, the personal and the huge, and how we bring those two together in caring for each other, whether, you know, in a hospital, in a medical context, or as we're encountering each other in our communities and our families.
I want to make sure to give anyone else the opportunity to talk before you hear me yap on a little bit more. But I think there's something within the idea of relationality, you know, and what you're talking about with immanence is the idea that you're not alone, even if you are alone, because there's the presence of something transcendent with you. And we are always already in relation. You know, we come out of the world, you know, through another person, and we're put into another person's arms. So that's truly the most, you know, one of the most fundamental things about being human. And so I think, yes, dealing with the tremendum, dealing with the mysterious aspects that are present is a part of our lives and a part of practicing medicine and being in a medical world. But the healing component comes in that aspect of being in relationship with someone else who attends to you and who says with their words or with their actions, in the words of John Swinton, the theologian, who makes the radical claim to say, it is good that you are in the world. It is good that you are here. It is good that you are in the world. And that statement, you know, almost like a political act, it's a healing moment in and of itself. And that's when you can look at the tremendum. So you have, I hope that those moments with your nurses were able to fortify you. So when you were alone, you were able to tap into that well. And I think it's an important critique of our medical system to say how impersonal it is, despite how many people are there. And it's incumbent on all of us to take that moral stance in the world and say it's good to our patients. It is good that you are here.
One thing I did find experientially, which I had taught in the classroom, and so it became more real experientially, was what my good friend Diane Comp, who was a pediatric oncologist at Yale, she used to emphasize that she often found that in talking to children when they had severe forms of cancer, that she needed to, as a physician, she needed to come down to their level so she could communicate with them. And I told her that I began to find out that when we're 70-year-old adults and we're in the ICU, that we want people to talk to us more like we're children, that I wanted to take off my professor hat and I wanted people to treat me like a little tender hurting child. And I think there may be something there that we as physicians and healers can learn about the human personality, that maybe our sophistication can block us from the person who's wanting to get back to the very simplistic, personal human care.
I'm so glad you said that, and I'm so glad you're here, and I'm glad you made it to the other side of that experience that you went through.
Thanks to Ruth Bergman and God.
And I would direct you, if you haven't read it, I bet you have. There's a great scene in the play Wit by Margaret Edson, and the professor sits on the patient on her bed and reads The Runaway Bunny. And it's such a beautiful, tender moment of love that scene really stays with me. And I think it illuminates what you're talking about.
Could I pipe up with a quick anecdote that I think addresses this issue of the convergence of something which is sacred, divine, or mysterious, something that's very, very human and earthy. I had this experience during Hurricane Katrina. Imagine it's day 5. We're stuck in Charity Hospital. It's the HIV ward. None of my house staff has shown up. There were no doctors there except for me and later my husband. And we had night nurses and day nurses and a ward full of really sick people with HIV. And we ran out of places to go to the bathroom. There were porta potties way down a dark hall. It was scary to go there, and then our flashlights ran out of battery, so you really couldn't hardly find a place to go to the bathroom, and people were defecating in the hallways of Charity Hospital, which is sort of symbolic of the dehumanization that all of us felt in our abandonment. And every morning I would go down to the meeting area in the lobby of Charity Hospital, and human resources would brief us on what was going on, and then we'd go back up to the floor and we'd try to communicate back to the nurses. And I came back, this was maybe day 4 or 5. I came back after one such meeting, and one of the night nurses, who was supposed to be asleep now, had waited for me, and she actually came to the door of the HIV unit and she took me by the hand. And she walked me like I was a little child. And she said, "Dr. Berggren, I want to show you how to go to the bathroom." And she had figured out, one of the rooms where there was a dialysis patient who doesn't pee. And so that toilet wasn't messed up. And also she found a little, not a porta potty, but what do you call those things, the bedside toilets. And she showed me how you could take a biohazard bag and kind of put it over the potty and sit over it and do your business and then wrap it up and get rid of it. And it's very earthy what I just told you. It doesn't sound divine or mysterious, but even in this moment of telling the story, I'm deeply, deeply moved by the compassion of my fellow healer, that she waited for me and treated me with such gentleness and knew that I'm human and wanted to show me that she recognized that we're all human and that she had figured out a solution to one of our many human challenges. And that's about as close as I can get to bringing together those two ideas of the marrying the deeply human and imperfection of our existence with what is awe-inspiring and transcendent.
Well, that's about it, Dr. Berggren. Thank you for sharing that story. That's really right on. We're coming up on time for this session, and so I want to really thank Dr. Julie Kutac for being here to share her wisdom with our community today. And I want to thank all of y'all for joining in the conversation. I'm very, very glad and proud that the Center for Medical Humanities and Ethics is making these conversations happen and working to keep our shared values alive and special during this difficult time. And if you guys will humor me, I would just like for folks to say individually or together, it is good that you are here. It is good that you are here.
It is
Good
good
that you're
that
here.
you are here.
It's great that you're here.
It's good that you're here.
It's
Good
good
that
that
you're
you're
here.
here.
Be here.
How is your spirit?
How is your spirit today? Thank you so much. Y'all have filled mine, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity, and I'm grateful for the work that y'all do. Thank you.
All right.
Good to see you all, new
Bye.
friends and old.
And I miss many of your faces.
Miss you guys. Thank you.
Miss all of you. It's really good to see you.